So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay, and I've been given a fair few of these, albeit they're on sort of varying stages of the small updates that have happened over the course of the past couple of months. So this is the one that I'm going to do first, purely because it chronologically happens first in terms of the updates that I'm going to have to cycle through. And this one, I mean, it was certainly given to me with the description that it is one of the closer battles that Silmarillion has seen, so I imagine it's going to be a very competitive affair, which is why I picked this one ahead of a couple of the others that were done on this particular and exact version of the game as it stands. But like I said, there's going to be a few other Silmarillion replays popping up over the course of the next few weeks, just on the subsequent versions of the game which also exist. So again, I'm trying to plot my course through them accordingly so that we can see a little bit more of it, and try and get every version in and try and do as many of these as I possibly can, because a lot of these are given to me in the form of, there's a replay channel on the Silmarillion Discord, which is where I usually get pointed to for this sort of thing. So yeah, it's one of those where I've got to use a little bit of my own judgment as well as just showing things that people send to me. But yeah, it's not precisely good versus evil in the strictest sense of the word, although certainly the red team are going to be a little bit more sort of evil aligned, I suppose. Even the Avari themselves are a little bit scary looking, not that that makes someone evil, but still. And then you also have the Easterlings and the horrors of Dungortheb marching alongside them. This is a pitch battle, however, so we will go through the blue team, although they're purple in Silmarillion, of course, first, and they are made up entirely of forces that would be considered good aligned for the most part anyway. And the player who has pointed me in the direction of many of these Silmarillion replays as they have been being produced is Lord of Belagos, and he is going to be playing on the blue team today, playing as the House of Feanor. Feanor, of course, one of the original factions to be a part of the very earliest builds of Silmarillion. They haven't changed too much since then. Their faction focus, after all, is relatively simple in the sense that they have high quality, heavily armoured elves supported by more medium tier human troops that are designed to support them. The Shield Bearers of Haleth are a simplistic unit of spears, and among the quality units that Silmarillion does have to offer, they maybe do lack a little bit, especially in terms of damage dealing because of their spears. However, as far as a front line goes, especially considering the expense that many of the other Feanor units have, you will often see the Shield Bearers of Haleth utilised as this auxiliary unit, and of course, anti-cavalry is always going to be at least somewhat useful. We have the Huntsmen of Darkling, a basic unit of archers, relatively lightly armoured, especially when you compare them to the elven units that Feanor have to offer. But they do also have that two-handed spear, so it's not quite so simple for enemy units of cavalry to charge into them. You may do a decent amount of damage initially because they are ultimately still lightweight archers, but if you hang around in melee with them for too long as cavalry, then the spears will start to make their impact, so there is a certain risk to trying that sort of thing. But again, the lighter armour does also mean that in terms of skirmishing they maybe lack a little bit, especially in comparison to some of the other options the Feanor have. We have the Footmen of Amras with the maximum level of armour upgrade that they can have. This makes them one of the more solid choices for a unit of line infantry that the game has to offer, purely because, again, that armour is going to be very, very useful. Line infantry units have a tendency to really prioritise their survivability, and packing on extra layers of armour is one of the easiest ways that you can multiply that effect. And Feanor, of course, just in general, have got that extra armour focus. Footmen of Amras, in terms of their damage dealing capabilities, are also pretty decent for what they are. There are a few other elven factions that maybe have better damage dealing options in this regard, but few are going to be able to match up to Feanor in terms of their ability to take a beating and just generally offer that really robust front line, which is generally what you want from this kind of unit. We have some Rangers of Haleth on the flank as well. These are the more hard-hitting javelins that Feanor have to offer, and they're going to be able to do a decent amount of damage. I mean, in melee they are going to be a little bit lackluster in comparison to many of the units that other factions have to offer, but having that access to quick, close-range punch at range is going to be something which is very useful in Silmarillion. I mean, just generally you have the discrepancy between hard-hitting javelins like this and then the more skirmish-orientated ones that have longer range, more ammunition, but lack the damage. On this occasion, though, the damage is going to be fairly useful. I mean, across the way it is the Easterlings, who lack a little bit in terms of archers as well, so you know that you're going to be able to get into range without too much damage being dealt. At the centre of things, we have the Accursed of Alqualonde. There is, of course, a heavy swordsman unit, a unique, almost like a regiment of renown from Warhammer, really, in the way that they're set up. The Two-handed swordsman class of unit has always been really, really good at dealing with light and medium units. The Accursed of Alqualonde also have the Relentless trait, which means they cannot be staggered. It means their ability to deal damage against certain types of units is very, very good. The Easterlings do have more heavy units that can withstand the beating that these guys can dish out more so, but it's still the kind of unit which certainly they're going to be wanting to try and diffuse pretty quickly, I would suggest. Several Shield Bearers of Halavorn as well as another line, and more Rangers of Halavorn as well. The thing that Feanor perhaps are most well known for, however, is their heavy cavalry. I don't think any faction in the game has got access to the variety of heavy cavalry that Feanor have, let alone the quality that they can also bring to bear. The Roqueni Magloro are the bodyguard tier cavalry that they have, mace men on horseback, so a little bit more of a melee cavalry oriented unit this, and it gives them a certain amount of domination when it comes to trying to win cavalry on cavalry engagements. They can of course be utilised as makeshift shock cavalry as well, though first and foremost in their mind is securing the cav advantage for Feanor, so that some of their other units can then take full advantage of that. Speaking of which, we do have these units back here. We have the Riders of the Pass, a unit of Horse Archers. Horse Archers are a type of unit we don't really see too much on the channel just in general anymore, purely because of where the balance of the old version of Reforged was. And yeah, I mean, Horse Archers, they can be a bit of a slow burn of a unit, but they can also be incredibly annoying to deal with from an opposition point of view. And the Mounted Company of Karufin, we see a little bit more of throwing projectile cavalry, purely because they can be utilised as their equivalent infantry units would be as well. So the Javelins will of course be capable of dealing a decent amount of damage against either fellow cavalry units or against infantry. Interesting to see no Lancers though from Feanor, but then all of this cavalry is pretty expensive and you can leave yourself a little bit thin on the ground infantry wise if you invest too much into them after all. Balagos deciding that the ranged cavalry is a little bit more important on this occasion. Necromancer from Enroth. Last time we saw a Silmarillion replay, this player was playing as Valinor that time as well, so clearly they have a favourite. Always going to be a bit of a fan favourite among the Silmarillion factions, this I think. The Sentries of Alqualonde, relatively light as an archer unit goes. I mean, Teleri units are intended to be the lighter counterparts to the main Valinor army, which is very expensive, very elite, all of that sort of thing. The Sentries, however, do at least offer you that ranged presence. Going off against the Avari, however, I don't know. I think in terms of sheer archer numbers, the Avari will probably be just fine against Valinor with their one option. We also have a ballista here, so maybe the intent is to try and force the Avari to come forward with a bit of artillery action, and they are it is manned by Hearthguard of Tyrion as well, so this is going to be a very solid crew to try and hack your way through as well, even if you do manage to engage them in melee. That may be the thinking behind bringing both of these artillery units, because while they are slightly curtailed units, you are still getting, between the two of them perhaps, a full unit of Hearthguard of Tyrion, as well as the potential punch that catapults and ballistae offer you. Just in behind we have Mariners of Alqualonde, Javelins. I think they are the skirmishing Javelins, if I'm not mistaken. But armour piercing is less important against a force like the Avari anyway, so perhaps that isn't quite the downside that it would be under normal circumstances. Plaza Guardians of Valimar do have armour piercing, interestingly enough, which is rare enough for a polearm unit, multiple HP as well. This is where we'll start to get into a lot of the more expensive Valinor units. We'll see how they get on. We've also got the Kinsmen of Ingwe, very, very strong unit, of course, bodyguard tier, even among the Avari, well, not the Avari, Valinor I should say. Two units of them either side of, I think, the single most expensive unit Valinor have, which are the Adepts of Tulkas. Armour piercing, once again, is it going to be that useful against the Avari? I don't know, but in terms of sheer quality, Valinor are not going to fear anyone, so that is perhaps the thinking here, and they do have a little bit of cover as well to make use of. And then at the back, Sentinels of Tyrion. This should be a unit which should be really good against the more lightly armoured Avari, and of course against really any of the other factions as well. None of the red team factions are especially focused around heavy units, the Easterlings being the most, but I don't know about that, we'll see. Then we have the House of Haleth, the Haladin, so the only human or completely human faction on the side of the blue team today. We have the Sueda Barothea of Thargelion. They're another unit that have the Relentless trait, which is fairly unique for a sort of medium armour line infantry unit, and it does set them apart. They are decent defensively, but that Relentless trait means they're going to be able to do damage at a faster rate than you would expect them to, and it makes them, again, it gives them that edge of, you've got to be sure when you engage with them that you're going to be able to overwhelm them fairly quickly. And and generally speaking, they're going to do more damage than you would expect, even if you do have that advantage. But make no mistake, the Haladin are not going to be one of these heavy-duty factions that are going to outlast people on the front line through sheer strength at arms and resilience. The Sword of Brothia may have that trait in their favour, but generally speaking, the Haladin are a hit-and-run ambush-style faction. They just have a few units which are a little bit more capable in this regard of facing off against the enemy. We have the Huskarlar of Thargelion. Throwing axes, of course, we all know the power of throwing axes across the various mods of Medieval 2, and they're going to be one of the better units for backing up the Sword of Brothia today. More Sword of Brothia at the back. We also have the Skuldmire of Haleth, a slightly more high-tier throwing action. I believe armor piercing is what sets them apart, so they are kind of similar in terms of how scary they are to the Shield Maidens from Rohan over in Reforged and associated mods. And the rest of the Haladin army, unsurprisingly, is hidden, and we cannot see them. So we'll have to keep an eye on what else they have at their disposal, but probably more throwing projectiles, I would suggest. A few Lightfoot archers and maybe a few units of cavalry that are hidden as well. Speaking of a faction that can hide many of their units, we have the Elves of Ossiriand under the command of Farkin. Not too surprising to see them either, because they are an archer-focused elven faction, maybe a little bit lighter in nature, but this is always the sort of faction which many players tend to gravitate towards, because having an archer-heavy force means that you can dictate the pace of the initial engagements a little bit more, perhaps, and just generally, obviously, people like the elves. Ossiriand as well is another faction that's been in Silmarillion since pretty much the outset. Earthen End Tower, one of the heavier units that they have at their disposal, interestingly enough, with their two-handed axe on their backs, and armour values which are higher than most of what the rest of Ossiriand have to offer. They stand in stark contrast to stuff like the Scouts of Gallium, which are hidden just in front of them, very lightweight, but because they can hide anywhere, they don't necessarily need to put themselves in harm's way of enemy projectiles right from the start. The Mythern and Tol Galen are pretty much the heaviest line infantry unit that Ossiriand have to offer. Also armour piercing with their maces, so it gives them another option for such things in melee, which they would sorely lack if not for the Mythern and for the Earthen End Tower just in front of them. But also they do offer the most solid unit of line infantry. They're very expensive, however, so you can't really blanket your line with them in the same way that, for example, the Footmen of Amras have for Feanor today. It's not really the way that Ossiriand do their business, much like the Haladin next to them. They're a little bit more about ambushing, lightweight troops, skirmishing, softening the enemy up and hitting them where it hurts. And that's going to be interesting to see how these two play off against one another today, being on the same side. Hunters of Rathloriel, you can see another unit of javelins with a spear on their backs. Again, more evidence of Ossiriand's affinity for skirmishing. Skirmishers of Rathloriel, and they are an archer variant of the unit we just saw, albeit they do not have the spears on their backs, and the rest of the Ossiriand army is hidden by the looks of things. Scouts of Gallion out in front, I would imagine. So, moving across to the red team, already digging into the higher terrain, not leaving anything to chance really, making sure they have a sure place to stand before moving forwards into Ossiriand's grip. We have the first of two Avari armies under the command of Stewie. He's got some bow wards of the Darkling Woods. Basic unit of spears this, nothing too special certainly, especially when you consider that they've got strips of bark and wood as their shields, and their armour is not tremendous either. But then the Avari are always kind of intended to have this lighter nature to them, and these units are more intended to be just in front of skirmishers and ambushing parties that they set up. We do have the Stonehewers, however, which are a little bit scarier in the sense that they are pretty damaging for the tier of unit that they are. Now, of course, they do have relatively low defensive values to go along with that, but still, a fairly damaging unit, and especially against a force like Ossiriand, they should be able to lay down a decent amount of damage if they can get into melee with them. The Thorned Ancients, which are a weird kind of unit, they don't actually have the highest damage values, but they are very, very resilient. So unlike the standard Ents which we see, which are more elephant class units, and they do a lot of damage very, very quickly, the Thorned Ancients not quite so much, and armour piercing is actually kind of necessary to bring them down in any sort of reasonable time frame. Interesting to see how they get on against Ossiriand here, because if Ossiriand start to show a bit of weakness, the Thorned Ancients can get right in and amongst their skirmishers and start really messing up their formations. The Moss Stalkers are the entry-level unit of archers, which are very similar, I would say, in terms of what they offer to the Scouts of Gallion, the only difference being the Scouts are already hidden and in position. We have more bow wards, we have more stone hewers. The shades of the guarded path, I mean, Ossiriand and the Avari, looking at this, do actually have a fair amount of similarities to one another, much like the Ossiriand elves have got the Mythern. The Avari here have got the shades, and they don't have armor piercing, but they do have slightly more numbers, and they do have very, very high base damages, which of course, against this particular foe, should serve them very well indeed, provided they can get into melee in the first place without being torn apart, which is going to be the main concern I would suggest for the Avari here. Ossiriand have got the edge on them in terms of long-range skirmishing, but when you get a little bit closer with javelins and with stuff like the Thorncasters here, who are essentially a throwing projectile unit, things will start to tilt in favour of the Avari, I think, especially when you consider the extra damage that their axe and shield units should be able to do. Another unit of Moss Stalkers, and the single entity unit as well that is the grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, effectively a living artillery piece. It's not super damaging in and of its own right, but it's the sort of thing which acts as a pillar, really, that the Avari can move around, and of course, slowly but surely over the course of a battle, you'd imagine the damage should be fairly significant. Then we have Alfia Koya. I'm going to call them Elf for the remainder of the fight, I think, because I'm definitely butchering that. We have the Horrors of Dungortheb. Apologies if you have any sort of fear of spiders, but there's no avoiding that when Dungortheb are on the field. The Karangwi Hunters, all of their spider units are very resilient individually as far as their individual unit models go, but relatively low in number. They get their numbers from elsewhere. The Karangwi Hunters, more horse archers on display as well, so they should be able to scout out the Haladin positions reasonably effectively. The Haladin themselves don't have the most obvious counters to units like this either, so we'll see. Duso Manuthan Beast Hunters, a regular unit of archers. I would suggest in terms of long-range skirmishing, neither the Haladin nor Dungortheb have got a huge amount of expertise. Dungortheb maybe slightly more, but we'll see. Just in behind we have the Duso Manuthan Flesh Feasters. I think they are the strongest unit of regular infantry that Dungortheb have at their disposal, essentially the bodyguard units that they have. And as far as their armour values go as well, by far and away, I think the strongest unit of infantry they have. Just in behind we have the Duso Manuthan Predators, so another example of a javelin hybrid infantry unit, which, considering the factions on display today with the Avari, Ossiriand, the Haladin, many of these factions have got access to this kind of unit, so combined arms is the way of things, and combined arms within single units as well. We have more Beast Hunters just in behind, and in a similar manner to the Avari, another single entity unit here in the Urush Abomination, and it offers very much the same sort of thing, in the sense that you have a living artillery piece that the whole faction can pivot around if need be. It's going to be a little bit more difficult for these two units to have full effectiveness, however, given the amount of Haladin and Ossiriand units that can hide. Then we have more Beast Hunters back here as well, but much like many of the factions on display today, actually, Dungortheb have got plenty of units that can hide, so there are more of them over here, but I'm sure that at least a portion of the army is hidden. Karangwi Hunters, more Beast Hunters. We've got the Karangwi Broodmother, so more of a sort of Mumakil-esque kind of feeling to these units, or maybe the Beasts of Gorgoroth, if you put them in mind. Duso Manuthan Predators once more. We have another, well, we actually have the Karangwi Bloodgorgers, which are a regular unit of melee cavalry, more or less. Only 13 of them, mind you. And then another unit of Flesh Feasters here at the back. Interesting to see how these Dungortheb units get on, actually. Then we have the 2nd Avari army under the command of Captain Gervais, Bow Wards of the Darkling Woods once more, Thorncasters. I imagine we're going to see largely the same sort of thing here, albeit a very different task awaits this Avari army compared to the other one, considering they have to face Valinor down. We have the Stone Hewers as well. Damage is all well and good, but it's going to be more difficult to make an impression on the really high-end units that Valinor have. It's going to have to be stuff like the Thorncasters and maybe javelins and skirmishing that the Avari will have to rely upon here, maybe a bit of kiting as well. Moss Stalkers, more Bow Wards, plenty of the Thorncasters, going to be one of the more important units here. Stone Hewers, Bow Wards, and at the back we have the Shades of the Guarded Path. As much as they are strong, they will find themselves outmatched here. Even the most basic of Valinor units is pretty much on a par with what the Shades can offer. But I'm sure that the Avari do have a few hidden units as well up their sleeve. And finally, we have the Easterlings, played by Parthan and Barsoom. They have had a little bit of an overhaul in terms of how they look. We've got the Sons of Ulfang over here, which offer the highest tier of armor piercing damage, that the Easterlings are capable of laying down. Rest of the army as well, I think we're going to see a few more examples of updated unit models as well. Indeed we are. Warband of Lothlin, still with big shields, but a slightly different look to them now. Intended to be a militia unit which is capable of certainly absorbing quite a lot of arrow fire and just being an all-round fairly efficient frontline fighting force. We have the Fangs of the Faithless as well, the one unit of foot archers that the Easterlings have at their disposal. They're going to be needed here. I mean, interesting skull and swords on the back of many of their shields. Are we the baddies? But yes. I don't know if they're necessarily, under normal circumstances anyway, I don't know if they would necessarily have a chance at facing off against Valinor in a skirmish fight, but maybe on this occasion it's a little bit different given the fact they've foregone the heavier elven archers that we usually see from them. The Lothlin units are the ones that are going to be capable of withstanding a lot of the damage that Feanor may throw at them. Clan Guard of Lothlin are a very decent unit of line infantry indeed. And as if that wasn't enough, they also have access to the halberdiers. Polearms are a bit of a rarity in Silmarillion, at least comparatively speaking, and that we haven't really seen any polearms yet. I mean, Ossiriand may have had them hidden. We did see the Plaza Guardians as well from Valinor, but other than that, nothing. So the halberdiers can certainly utilise that to their advantage against the armour of Feanor, try and dictate the engagement that way. More Clan Guard back here, halberdiers. We've got the Salamandrine Guard, of course, who are a very effective unit of horse archers indeed, though the back and forth between the horse archers here could be rather interesting between the Salamanders and the Feanor examples of such cavalry. The Ravagers of Himring as well, more Falk's infantry, very good charge bonus, although they don't have the armour piercing of the Sons of Ulfang. They should still be pretty effective against their fellow humans fighting under Feanor's banner today. Albeit they do have their obvious weaknesses in terms of their own survivability. Croatani Marauders, more throwing axes as well, relatively cheap but pretty damaging if they can get into place, but Feanor will probably be making it a priority to try and shut such units down fairly fast. Pillagers of Himring represent the same sort of thing, only on horseback, so the cavalry engagement here is going to be rather intriguing, I would suggest. Feanor usually enjoy a definite advantage here, but it's going to be a little bit more complicated based on what the Easterlings have. The Amberona Honour Guard, I really like the look of these guys actually. Now, they're very high def indeed. They are the more defensive bodyguard unit that the Easterlings have, and certainly in terms of their defensive prowess, they wouldn't look out of place stats-wise in Feanor's roster, which is a big compliment to give. We have the Croatani Huntsmen, which is another unit of ranged cavalry with their javelins. Moving across, we also have some Pillagers of Himring and some more Croatani Huntsmen. So, it's going to be a relatively fast and furious affair, I would imagine. It's going to be on this side of the battlefield where things get underway first, I would suggest. I think between Valinor and this Avari army first and foremost. There's a little bit more space between the armies over on the other side, but no need for a cut here. Without further ado, let's get this show on the road, shall we? Perhaps the slight problem that they may have here, the Valinor elves, is the fact that they are a little bit isolated from one another. I mean, the Ballista offers a little bit of support. The Moss Stalkers do have that morale debuffing effect from their poison projectiles, though again, Valinor being what they are, very unlikely to be affected by that unless the situation has already turned completely against them, and that is not likely to be the case in terms of just a regular skirmishing affair. Interesting to see the fact that Flaming Shot is attempting to be utilised as well. A little bit of morale shocking effects going the other way, perhaps. A little bit more likely to work at the very least, so I'm still not certain it's all that important. Thorncasters, on the other hand, should be really, really effective, seeing as they are going to be pretty good against more lightly armoured units. And that is exactly what the Teleri represent, and you're unlikely to be able to get too much in the way of effectiveness off against some of the heavier units Valinor have to offer. This is a bit of a weird choice. Hearthguard of Tyrion on the way forwards. Thorncasters once again getting in position to reload. Karangui Hunters also starting to move forward, again targeting down Valinor. This could prove to be a fairly effective thing to do if Mevin is unwilling to move forward with his Haladin forces. Valinor, considering they are sticking out a little bit further than their allies, could end up being the ones to pay the price there. And again, the Hearthguard are the ones abandoning their artillery piece making the attempt to move forward. I mean, a little bit of indecision here perhaps from Valinor, not quite sure what they want to do. They can't afford to just let things be, I suppose, with the Avari in the position that they're in, but they don't necessarily need to panic. In many ways, I actually think pulling back behind the terrain would probably be for the best from a Valinor perspective. Their initial position has maybe not helped matters too much. Garangui hunters over here starting to make the attempt at pressurising the Haladin a little bit as well. I think actually we will go down to half speed, at least on a temporary basis. Garangui hunters, they don't have the highest volume of projectiles here, but they're not going to be going anywhere anytime soon, especially given the Haladin's lack of ability to respond to this sort of pressure. And the Avari are actually willing to move down into the territory that Ossiriand are occupying as well, at least to a certain extent. Riders of the Pass moving forward onto this flank over here, starting to fire across into some of the Easterling forces that are looking maybe to link up with some of the Avari. And there's also the small matter of the other cavalry wing over here, though we could be seeing a bit of a clash between the two cavalry units fairly quickly. Fangs of the Faithless already shooting at the Huntsman of Thargelion, as we've already mentioned briefly in the army composition phase. It's one of the rare situations where the Easterlings may have a bit of an edge in terms of their ranged prowess over a faction like Feanor. Pillagers of Himring already taking a couple of losses, as will the Salamandrine Guard. Mounted company of Karufin moving forward. You don't want to be getting your horse archers involved in a ranged slugfest against a unit of reasonably tanky horse javelins like the mounted company. As much as the Salamanders are a very effective cavalry versus cavalry combatant, this may be one of the situations where they won't be enjoying too much the situation that lies in front of them. Further across, Garangui hunters skittering along. Still the Haladin unmoved in terms of moving forwards. They will maintain their position for the time being, not answering the taunts of the red team as they try to make an impact. The ballista crew has now remounted. Unfortunately for them, however, Valinor are the ones that have struggled the most with the initial situation, I think. I think their initial positioning has been taken reasonable advantage of by the red team, and so far the Avari have definitely had the better end of this skirmish fight, with the Teleri I think maybe panicking a little bit. The positions they're in not ideal, and there's also the fact that the Thorncasters, simply when they get in range of a unit of light archers like this, are going to be really, really solid. And this also takes away from Valinor's ranged presence fairly significantly, not completely because of their artillery focus, though that is still worth bearing in mind. Over yonder, Pillagers of Himring doing some damage against the Huntsman of Thargelion. The sheer amount of cavalry here proving to be a little bit of a problem for Feanor, which is a rare enough thing to say, although the mounted company of Karufin should be more than a match for the Pillagers of Himring in melee terms. Throwing axes, going back and forth. Once again, it's the light archers which are the ones taking the brunt of the initial damage for the blue team, which they won't mind too much. One of the least important units going into the late game in terms of deciding things. Salamandrine Guard still firing the odd flaming projectile in, as well as the poison projectiles as well, so plenty of morale debuffing effects being sent downrange so far. Moving off into the middle, Thorned Ancients now moving forward with the incredibly depleted Teleri archers that were on the front line now. The Avari moving forward to clean things up. I think Captain Gervais's Avari army has done very well out of things so far. None of these engagements have been completely decisive yet, but you would certainly say that the red team have had the better of the opening engagements. And over here, the destruction of this artillery piece, I think that must be from the Urush Abomination. It's the only thing that would have the ability to crumble artillery pieces at this range. Though this does mean they now have a free unit of infantry, but it's yet another one of Valinor's ranged units which is now no longer going to be in active service for the rest of the battle. Thorned Ancient shuffling away as well. It looks as though the Easterlings have at least been sent packing over here, Riders of the Pass helping to reinforce things over here, and in spite of the damage that Feanor have taken, I would say it's probably 6 of one and half a dozen of the other in terms of who's had the better end of this engagement so far. You could give maybe a very slight edge to the Easterlings, given that many of their units are maybe a little bit more well suited for the kind of engagement this has been so far, but Riders of the Pass already starting to claw that back as we speak, so I wouldn't be too concerned if I were Feanor, and indeed Easterlings well known for having a fairly limited ammunition supply, so this is the sort of thing which won't last forever. That there was, yes, it was the Urish Abomination, trying to make a play at doing some more damage to Valinor, who have definitely been the ones singled out so far among the red team, or the blue team's forces I should say, but Kinsmen of Ingwe are going to be fairly difficult to bring down. I mean, Gloom Hunters of the Trackless Dark going to be capable of dealing a fair amount of damage, plenty of support coming in as well from Javelins. Rigswear of Brethel also in position, so the Haleth have got a few units in close range support now, throwing projectiles and the like, but these lighter units, I think it's going to have to be half speed once again, at least temporarily. But the Thorned Ancients should do pretty well in melee against the Rigswear. And then just in behind we also have the Skjaldmire, which we've already spoken about, but they're going to be sent packing the other way by the Karangwi Hunters once more. The Avari sensing a decent opportunity to do some damage here. Valinor, however, moving forward with their own support now in the Mariners of Alqualonde. And I mean, this is fairly all in. I don't know whether the Avari have whittled down Valinor enough to the point where this is going to yield the results they seek. I mean, the Plaza Guardians are setting up a solid front line, especially with the support of the Sentinels of Tyrion. A lot of these lighter Avari units are not going to stand a chance, unfortunately for them. They do have a little bit of support coming across from the Easterlings though in response to that, Feanor are also going to be shuffling some of their units across as well. I mean, having a look way over here, Ossiriand and the Avari still yet to really clash with one another. It's a risky strategy on both their parts, because it means if their team starts to lose elsewhere, they're going to be forced into making moves that maybe they do not want to. But it's going to be over here, and Mariners of Alqualonde moving into position. And as we already mentioned, their type of javelin should be pretty effective against the Avari, and Rangers of the Hidden Path, one of the more dangerous units that the Avari have at their disposal, so definitely the right thing to do to try and bring them down. The Thorncasters still doing a decent amount of damage, and the Kinsmen of Ingwe, balance of forces evenly matched, even when faced with some of the more monstrous units. Just in behind, Rigswear and the Urish Abomination still attempting to do a fair amount of damage, and the Haleth may be more likely to rout in the face of the fearsome monsters and projectiles that are being utilised here. That looks like it's going to be a direct hit. These fiery projectiles have a tendency to be pretty good against the more lightly armoured units as well. The Rigswear, it is good at least that the Haleth are backing Valinor up a little bit. I was a little bit worried they'd be hung out to dry based on how the battle had gone in the earliest stages, but that is not going to be the case. The Adepts of Tulkas moving forward, I mean, armour piercing may be the order of the day with them, but their level of quality is so much higher than these basic Avari spears, and there goes the Avari General. Just like I said, I mean, the opening here from the Avari was really strong, but I don't know whether they had it in them to try and overwhelm a force like Valinor when really all of their very best units were still up and running. I think maybe taking the slower approach even still probably would have been the play, and Shades of the Guarded Path, the very best they have to offer in melee, are going to be no match whatsoever for stuff like the Sentinels of Tyrion. Rangers of the Hidden Path moving forward in support. I mean, you can see here some Bow Wards, Footmen of Amras. I mean, Feanor moving forward to try and prevent any sort of support that the Easterlings may wish to give. And the Easterlings, I think they wish to give fair amount of support, though not too much in the way of infantry. Their infantry still maintaining its position. What remains of all the Easterling cavalry was certainly making their way across to try and make something happen there, but Rohatani Huntsmen not going to be a match for the Riders of the Pass in pure melee terms, and so far the initial skirmishing may have gone the way of the red team, but across the battlefield now, where we're seeing a move forwards, an aggressive move forwards, the high quality, high armour approach of some of the defenders, well I say defenders, blue team here, having an impact. Moss Stalkers pulling out their clubs in melee. Still the Urish Abomination attempting to do a fair amount of damage. The Ents are moving forward from Ossiriand as well, so they've been siphoned off, a sign perhaps that the Avari on the other side of the field should be moving forward to try and take advantage of the fact that the heaviest hitting of the Ossiriand units are no longer present on that side of the line. The Ballista crew right in and amongst the Thorncasters who are shaken. Mariners of Alqualonde here as well, and you can see alongside the rigs where that initial assault is starting to come undone now, and the Avari have sent forward pretty much everything they have. Their allies have not. Maybe that splintered and fractured approach is going to be their undoing in the end. Scouts of Galleon revealing themselves, and the initial skirmishing begins. What is this cavalry unit? Sentries of Galleon, the Horse Archer variant. Another unit of sentries as well. Neither the Avari nor Ossiriand are really good in a straight up slugfest at range. Both of them have got the option to do fair amounts of damage when fighting on their own terms, but neither one is going to gain a real advantage from setting up flat front lines like this. Maybe Ossiriand, because they had all of their units ready and waiting for this eventuality, whereas the Avari had to move forward. Some Haskalar moving forward maybe. The weakness here in the middle of the map is now being sensed. Some of the Thorned Ancients are still alive, still trying to finish off the Rigswear, who were the first Haladin unit to come to the aid of Valinor. The Dragoons as well from the Haladin, another unit of Horse Archers. Actually no, they're the Throwing Axe variant, aren't they? Plenty of Throwing Axe cavalry on the field, it would seem. Karangwi Broodmothers moving forward, trying to make something happen here. I mean, they're scary, but this is where the blue team are probably at their strongest at dealing with this kind of unit. I mean, the Plaza Guardians and the Sentinels of Tyrion put together, even in the slightly compromised position that they're in now, should still be more than capable of bringing down these spiders, and indeed they do start to fall. Many Thorncasters are routing as the fire continues to rain down. Although there goes the Valinor General. Maybe not too surprising given the treatment they've been given so far in this battle, but one thing you would say is they're not going to be too worried, I don't think. Valinor should be able to maintain their discipline even with a situation like this. The Thorncasters starting to crumble the artillery, of course throwing projectiles pretty good at dealing with artillery at close range. So that's something which may be a real problem for them. We have the spiders still running amok. Mariners of Alqualonde, we can see on the front line here the Easterlings trying to block the reinforcements of Feanor, as they were trying to also support Valinor. I don't know how long the Easterlings are going to be able to hold this line. I mean, yes, they have the Halberdiers, who are such an important unit to how the Easterlings act, as we have seen in the past, but I don't know about this one. It's going to be tough for them. Vanguard of Lothland last stand as well. The Easterling infantry starting to move forward as well, maybe trying to take advantage of the fact that Feanor have started to siphon off some of their resources, but Warband of Lothland, the only ones moving in. Much like we saw with Valinor early on, actually, I think the Easterlings are a little bit guilty of maybe being caught in two minds here. They probably would have been better off sending their entire force to try and assist the Avari when the Avari went to be aggressive. Because ultimately the end result here is going to be largely the same, where it's going to be one large mosh pit. It's just that the blue team are going to be in a surer place within that engagement by the time the Easterlings arrive. Unfortunately for the red team, I would suggest. Ravagers of Himring are arriving, mind you. Sons of Ulfang should be fairly effective against most of the reinforcements that Feanor are going to be committing forward, and actually should be fairly decent against the kind of units that Valinor still have over here as well. But I don't think Valinor are going to be in... Well, Valinor are going to be wounded, but they should still have enough along with Feanor to try and repel any sort of Easterling efforts to affect the outcome of the battle. You can see with a lot of the Halidin now moving forward. I think when it comes to reinforcing their allies, the blue team have simply been more decisive. And it's turned into effectively a 3v3 over here and then one isolated little 1v1 over here between Ossiriand and the Avari. If the red team are going to get back into this, they will need the Avari to be victorious over here. Sentries of Galleon doing their best to ensure that that's not the case. Thorncasters doing their thing also. Pretty much all of the Halidin. Anyway, some of the units are allegedly still hidden over there. Saw them... Oh, it's the Randirim actually, so no, it's Ossiriand units that are still waiting in the wings over there. I think pretty much the entirety of the Halidin are now over here. Fresh lines of Swear to Brothia to try and repel any sort of reinforcements. The Avari still fighting, in all fairness to the Avari. It's not really their modus operandi to try and tackle a force like Valinor in overall combat like that, but they've given it a damn good go. The advantage they carved out very early, however, not enough to give them the advantage that they sought. Tiny Marauders doing their thing, and still the Sons of Ulfang moving forward alongside the rest of the Falk's infantry. Ravagers of Himring trying to take advantage of slightly thinner on the ground front lines that Valinor are now working with. In come the Sentinels of Tyrion. Sons of Ulfang charging uphill. I mean, this is all well and good along with the Thorncasters, but there's still plenty of Sentinels of Tyrion. And the additional backup of the Swear to Brothia should mean that any sort of shock value that the Sons of Ulfang are worth should be evened out quite nicely. More javelins being utilised, do so Manuthan Predators. I mean, we haven't really seen too much of the Dungortheb infantry yet, and it may be up to the Halidin to try and begin that engagement. And so far, the Halidin may be standing at arm's length just a little bit too long in the face of all of these javelins. The Kinsmen of Ingwe charging after and trying to bring down the Urush abomination. Still haven't seen either of the two grandfathers of the Deepwood Hearth really do much in this battle, but it's entirely possible we've simply missed them. More of the Easterling reinforcements getting routed off by the terrifying presence of the Ents. Further along, the Halberdiers trying to salvage the situation, but their formation not quite able to get into place before the Accursed of Alqualonde started doing their thing. The Ents also start lumbering into place. The Ents still very much alive, of course. Halberdiers breaking under the weight of the Ents, and the Easterlings starting to rout off as well. Defeat seems certain for the Sons of Ulfang, and yeah, reinforcements from the Easterlings arrive just a little bit too late, you would suggest. So the Easterlings and the Avari over here are certainly going to fall, but I mean, as we've already mentioned, the infantry and even the cavalry actually from Dungortheb should still be in fairly decent working order, and actually the Amberona Honour Guard have decided to move over here as well to try and regroup with the more monstrous faction. Do so Manuthan Flesh Feasters have taken a fair amount of hits. I think more than anything this engagement has been decided by throwing projectiles from both sides, and there we see an example of that. Further along, Flesh Feasters on this front line as well. We've got the bugs that are sticking out of the ground as well that have been since dealt with by the Halidin, but the Flesh Feasters a step too far, and in many ways the Flesh Feasters represent probably one of the better types of units to try and deal with the Halidin that you're likely to see. At the back, Huskalar of Thargelion. Try and use throwing projectiles to claw their way back into this one. Meanwhile over here, we still haven't really seen go hammer and tongs at one another. It's been an entirely skirmish-based affair. Cavalry has traded back and forth a little bit, but neither one has been truly willing to make the moves. I think it has to be the Avari as well, based on how this battle has gone. I mean, yes, Dungortheb is still standing, but you have to assume that Dungortheb are also going to really start to struggle as the remains of Valinor and Feanor also make their way across to assist the Haladin in removing them from proceedings. At that point, the Avari would then be fighting effectively 4v1. And that is not what you want to be seeing if you're Stewie. Dragoons charging in as well, the Flesh Feasters, despite an initial engagement that was working for them, overwhelmed by throwing projectiles and cavalry charges. And yeah, you would imagine from this point it's hard to see anything other than a blue team victory. Victory seems certain for the Riders of the Past. Still plenty of cavalry roaming around as well for the Blues. Sentinels a little bit scattered, perhaps. There's a fairly hefty amount of units still from Feanor. Still one unit of halberdiers left alive. So what will Dungortheb do? I mean, they're going to have to pull back. What have we got going on over here? Do we have... Yes, we do. Perhaps as if hearing me, the Avari have moved forward to try and capitalise on the Ossiriand position, being more skirmish orientated, shades of the guarded path. Surely with that javelin support they won't be victorious against the Erfinen Tower, I would imagine. Hunters of Rathloriel not being engaged in melee thus far. Erfinen Tower doing their thing. Loststalkers moving forward. I mean, even over here, I'm not entirely certain the Avari are going to be victorious. I think the setup from Ossiriand was always designed with this kind of battle in mind. Further back, scouts of Galleons still alive, sentries of Galleons still in their shooting circle. Bow wards of the Darkling Woods, trying to deal with the Outriders of Dweilwyn. In all fairness, the Thorned Ancients, if there's one unit you want to be fighting off against them as Ossiriand, it's going to be the Mythern and Tolgalen, the armor-piercing damage that they deal. Too much to ignore. Scouts of Galleon firing away as well, still with ammunition left. And there's a small matter of the Randirim across the way as well, who are going to be ripping their way through what remains of that Avari attack. I mean, that Avari attack I think was born more out of desperation than anything else, so it's a little bit more understandable. Projectile being ballooned way up in the air. Dungortheb attempting to get into a position where they can mount some sort of final stand, but the Haladin cavalry making it far more difficult for them to retreat than it would otherwise be. Dusomnuthan Beast Hunters trying to chase them down. Surely there's not going to be enough left of Dungortheb. Still some fighting happening over here. And this would be why. Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, this is the first time we've actually seen this guy in action. There goes a general, probably the Easterling one, I would imagine. This was around the same area where the Amberona Honour Guard were. Branch Stalkers of the Green Sea, also getting overwhelmed and overrun. Plenty of javelins hitting the grandfather there, as he continues to try and make a nuisance of himself. Yes, I concur, announcer. I don't think there's going to be a single red team victory on the field either, considering how this engagement with the Avari continues to go. I was worried that was Dungortheb for a second then, considering they've got plenty of spider units which can at least make a decent shake of a final stand. Good to see that that is not in fact the case. Feanor still, I think, the healthiest army, but then they didn't really have to engage with much of their infantry until they were in a very advantageous position. The Beast Hunters will be able to do a little bit of damage to them on the approach. What are all of these spiders still worth? They've still got the Urish Abomination as well. Something Something worth bearing in mind, I suppose. Skirmishers of Rathloriel. Finishing off what remains of the Bow Wards. If they were a slightly more heavy-duty faction, the Avari, maybe this would have worked out for them, at least on this flank, but considering how Ossiriand set themselves up, they couldn't have really asked for it to go much better for them. Hunters of Rathloriel and Mythern on the way forwards as well. The Haleth cavalry revealing itself within the encampment as well, and surely with some rear charges, that's going to be all it takes to... I don't know if the Spiders or the Urish Abomination will necessarily rout, but certainly what remains of the Duso Manuthan probably will. Further along, Dragoons, Mounted Company of Karufin. In the end, this has actually been more one-sided than I would have expected based upon the description of the battle that I was given, but no matter. Certainly in the form of teamwork, it's a very good example of how a team of 4 on a pitched battle can move with one another. Decisive reinforcements and moving with a little bit more authority after a fairly early wobble. You can't argue that the correct outcome has played out. Along here, the Dragoons charging in, almost instantly routing the Duso Manuthan Beast Hunters. There goes the Dungortheb General. That is going to be that. See much of anything else. The Spiders can rout, at least the regular ones. I guess it's because they're in a last stand, where their stats are reduced to literally 0, and they become naught but cannon fodder. Balance of forces is evenly matched, eh? I don't know if awed is necessarily the right word, but certainly a very comprehensive victory nonetheless. Another pitch battle that we see Silmarillion in, and yeah, definitely the right outcome there. I mean, you can see that Dungortheb got the most kills. That's not too surprising. I mean, a lot of their units were better set up for dealing with the stuff that, in particular, Valinor had, but also the more heavily armoured units that Feanor, and they were the ones that lasted the longest, ultimately. It's a shame, really, as well, because the initial moves that the red team made were the right ones. I feel as though the moment they decided to try and strike was not the right moment, because still Feanor and Valinor, they all had, you know, too much still left in the tank for that kind of thing to work, especially as a faction like the Avari. If you're going to do that, then you need to make sure that your hard-hitting projectile stuff like the Rangers of the Hidden Path have got clear shots and are not going to get focused down, which was not the case here. So maybe just springing their plan a little bit too soon, the red team. But other than that, it was initially fairly competitive, and then ultimately, through decisions made, you have to say that the right outcome did transpire. What did the damage for Balagost's army then? The Roquani Magloro, which we actually didn't see running around on the field today, unfortunately. We saw plenty of the Mounted Company of Karufin and Riders of the Pass, however, in spite of maybe the Easterling army offering more of a challenge on horseback than Feanor are used to dealing with. They were still ultimately too strong for their more lightly armoured Eastern foes. The Accursed of Alqualonde were only really committed later on, so that's why they have a very limited amount of casualties inflicted. Huntsmen did okay. So yeah, perhaps unsurprisingly from a Feanor perspective, given the fact that much of their infantry actually didn't see much action, it was their cavalry that did the business for them. So yeah, big thank you to Lord of Balagos for pointing this and many others in my view. And we will be seeing a little bit more of Silmarillion in the upcoming few weeks as well, purely because this one was first, because otherwise it would have got buried and I wouldn't have had the correct version of Silmarillion to play it on, which is why we're seeing it now. The ones that are upcoming have a couple of extra patches applied to them, including one which was called the Mithrim patch, so I assume that the Grey Elves got a few changes from that one. We'll see. If there is a siege battle in one of the replays I've been pointed in the direction of, then I will try and show that, because time and again we see plenty of Silmarillion, but it's always on battles like this, which they do act as a decent little palate cleanser from the usual siege battles that we do see. But it would be neat to see a large-scale siege on Silmarillion again, because it feels like it's been a good long time since we've seen that. So if I am able to, I'll dig through and see if I can find one of them to be the next Silmarillion battle that we show. But if not, then at the very least it will be a further updated version of Silmarillion from even this one. So there is that as well. So yeah, big thank you to Lord of Balagos, big thank you to all the players that were part of this battle replay. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.